Amid the chaos of war and the relentless bombardments on a tiny Pacific island, one woman stood as a beacon of hope. Anne Gilbert, a nurse who defied the odds, faced death, despair, and deprivation to save lives during the brutal siege of Wake Island. This is the extraordinary story of courage under fire, a tale of resilience, ingenuity, and the unyielding power of the human spirit. What drove her to keep going when everything seemed lost? Step into her world and discover a story that will leave you breathless. Before we continue, friends, I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel. It takes just a second for you, but it gives me incredible motivation to keep creating these videos. I'd also greatly appreciate your comments. Thank you for your support, and now, let's dive back into the story. December 1941. The world was on fire. Across the Pacific, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor sent shockwaves through the American military and civilian populations. Just hours later, the Japanese war machine turned its sights to Wake Island, a remote atoll that most Americans couldn't have located on a map. Yet, for the U.S. military, this tiny island was a critical piece in the Pacific puzzle. Located roughly 2,300 miles west of Honolulu, Wake Island was a strategic outpost, a halfway point for military planes and ships traveling across the vast expanse of ocean. For the 449 Marines, sailors, and construction workers stationed there, Wake was more than a distant speck of land. It was a line in the sand. If the Japanese seized it, they could threaten Hawaii and disrupt vital supply lines between the U.S. and its allies. Defending this barren outpost was a daunting task, but the men stationed there were not alone. Among them was Anne Gilbert, a young Navy nurse whose presence on the island would become the stuff of legend, and had arrived on Wake Island in September 1941, 3 months before the Japanese attack. Born and raised in Ohio, she had grown up in a modest household and had worked her way through nursing school with an unshakable determination to serve. Like many women of her generation, she believed deeply in the ideals of service and sacrifice. The Navy offered her a chance to do both. When the opportunity arose to transfer to Wake Island as part of a medical support team, and volunteered without hesitation, despite warnings that the remote outpost was vulnerable to attack. Wake Island was a stark, sun-scorched place. Its coral reefs and jagged coastline made it both a natural fortress and a trap. The men of the small garrison were charged with building airstrips, fortifications, and barracks, while also maintaining a fleet of aircraft ready for action. For Anne, her role as a nurse seemed simple on the surface. Treat injuries, keep morale high, and prepare for emergencies. But as tensions escalated across the Pacific in late 1941, she began to sense that her peaceful days on Wake were numbered. Then came December 7th. News of the attack on Pearl Harbor reached Wake Island via crackling radio transmissions. The men, stunned and angered, quickly prepared for the inevitable, and, too, understood the gravity of what had happened. Though she had no military training beyond her medical expertise, she worked alongside the garrison to ready the infirmary, stockpile medical supplies, and organize evacuation plans for the civilians on the island. The reality, however, was grim. Wake Island had no escape routes. The men and women stationed there knew they would either hold the island or die trying. The following day, the first Japanese reconnaissance planes appeared in the sky from the ground and could see the ominous glint of sunlight on their metal wings as they circled like vultures. The sight chilled her, but she kept her composure, focusing instead on the wounded Marines from training mishaps and minor skirmishes. Her calmness under pressure would soon prove invaluable. Among the garrison, morale was a strange mixture of tension and resolve. Some men joked nervously, calling Wake the Alamo of the Pacific. Others silently cleaned their rifles and whispered prayers under their breath, and became a quiet anchor for them, tending to their injuries, listening to their fears, and reminding them of the importance of their mission. For a handful of young Marines, she was the last connection to the world beyond the atoll, a sister, a confidant, and, for some, a symbol of what they were fighting to protect. By December 8th, the Japanese assault began in earnest, and would soon find herself thrust into a role she could never have anticipated, one that would demand every ounce of her courage, ingenuity, and compassion. The first Japanese bombing raid on Wake Island began with a low, mechanical hum that grew into a deafening roar. For Private Henry Carson, a 22-year-old Marine from Iowa, the sound was unlike anything he had ever heard. At first, he froze, staring up at the sky as the silver shapes of Japanese bombers appeared on the horizon. A fellow Marine, Private First Class Sam Ortiz, shoved him into a trench. "Keep your head down, Henry," Ortiz barked, his voice sharp with urgency. Moments later, the first wave of bombs fell, and the world around them erupted in chaos. Anne Gilbert was already at the infirmary when the raid began. The building, a simple wooden structure, was woefully under-equipped for the scale of the attack. The sharp cracks of explosions rattled the walls, sending plaster crumbling to the floor. Outside, a thick plume of black smoke rose over the airfield as Japanese bombs tore through the line of parked Wildcats, and grabbed her medical kit and ran toward the airfield, her breath shallow as adrenaline took over. By the time she reached the scene, it was a nightmare. The acrid stench of burning fuel filled the air, mingling with the cries of the wounded. A Marine, barely out of his teens, clutched at a jagged piece of shrapnel embedded in his thigh, his face pale with shock. "You'll be okay?" Anne said, kneeling beside him. Her voice was steady, despite the chaos around her. She cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his uniform and pressed a bandage against the wound, ignoring the hot spray of blood on her hands. The bombing lasted less than an hour, but the aftermath felt endless. The infirmary quickly overflowed with wounded men, some with burns, others with shattered limbs, and worked with a small team of corpsmen, directing them with calm precision. At one point, she ran out of clean bandages and improvised by cutting strips of fabric from discarded parachutes. She boiled them in a pot over an open flame to sterilize them, her hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew that every second counted. Among the injured was Sam Ortiz, who had thrown himself over Henry Carson during the raid. A piece of shrapnel had lodged in Ortiz's back, dangerously close to his spine. "Don't let me die, Doc," he whispered as Anne examined him. His breathing was shallow, and his skin was clammy with sweat. "Not today," Anne replied, her tone resolute. She worked quickly, extracting the shrapnel with forceps and stitching the wound with a steady hand. Ortiz winced but managed a weak smile. "Guess I owe you one." The heroism of the island's defenders wasn't limited to the battlefield. Jack Thomas, a civilian contractor with Morrison Knudsen, had no formal combat training, but when the bombers struck, he sprang into action. He dragged 2 injured men from a burning building, ignoring the searing heat and the risk of further explosions. When asked why he had risked his life, he shrugged and said, "They needed help. That's all there is to it." The first bombing raid left the island's defenders battered but unbroken. Over the next 3 days, Japanese planes returned daily, targeting the airfield anti-aircraft guns and supply depots. And barely slept, moving between the infirmary and makeshift triage stations to tend to the wounded. She developed a system, prioritizing those with the best chances of survival. It was a harsh reality, but one she faced with unflinching determination. On December 11th, the Japanese launched their first amphibious assault on the island. A flotilla of warships approached Wake under the cover of darkness, carrying hundreds of enemy soldiers. As dawn broke, the defenders sprang into action. The remaining Wildcats roared into the sky, strafing the landing craft with .50 caliber machine guns. On the ground, Marine gunners manned their 5-inch coastal defense guns, aiming at the approaching ships. The battle was fierce. A direct hit from one of the coastal guns sank the Japanese destroyer Hate, sending it to the ocean floor in a fiery explosion. Another destroyer, the Kisaragi, followed shortly after. Despite their heavy losses, the Japanese pressed on, their landing craft inching closer to shore. in the infirmary and could hear the thunder of artillery and the sharp crack of rifle fire. Wounded men began pouring in, some carried by their comrades, others dragging themselves across the blood-stained floor, and moved from one patient to the next, her hands stained red as she sutured wounds and applied pressure to stop the bleeding. At one point, she used a discarded helmet as a basin to clean surgical instruments, her resourcefulness earning the admiration of the corpsmen working alongside her. Outside, Henry Carson fought to hold his position on the beach. He had never felt fear like this before, but the memory of Sam Ortiz shielding him during the bombing raid gave him strength. When a Japanese soldier charged at him with a bayonet, Carson fired his rifle, the recoil jolting his shoulder. The enemy soldier crumpled to the ground, and Carson forced himself to focus. "Keep it together," he muttered, gripping his rifle tightly. The Japanese assault was ultimately repelled, thanks to the determination and ingenuity of Wake's defenders. By the end of the day, 2 Japanese destroyers had been sunk, and the landing force had been forced to retreat. The victory was a testament to the courage of the garrison, but it came at a high cost. Dozens of Americans were killed or wounded, and the island's limited supplies were stretched to the breaking point. And worked late into the night, her body aching with exhaustion. As she bandaged a Marine with a fractured arm, he looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "How do you do it?" he asked, and paused for a moment, her eyes meeting his. "Because I have to," she said simply. "Because you need me to." Her words captured the unyielding spirit of Wake Island's defenders. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but they refused to give up. And at the center of it all was a nurse who proved that heroism wasn't confined to the battlefield. It was found in every act of compassion, every life saved, and every moment of hope in the face of despair. When the Japanese fleet reappeared on December 11th, its presence was unmistakable. The low thunder of engines carried across the still waters before dawn, a chilling prelude to the bombardment that would soon follow. The defenders of Wake Island, though battered and sleep-deprived, moved to their positions with a grim determination. Among them was Corporal Joe Adams, a wiry Marine from Louisiana who hadn't spoken a word since losing his best friend, Private Eddie Morales, in the previous raid. Joe clutched the lucky coin Eddie had given him and muttered a silent promise. "I'll make it count." At the infirmary, Anne Gilbert prepared for the worst. The previous days had been a blur of blood and exhaustion, and supplies were critically low. This morning, however, brought an unusual surprise. A civilian named Tom Hensley arrived carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Tom, a mechanic who had been maintaining construction equipment before the war broke out, had fashioned makeshift tourniquets and splints from scavenged machine parts. "It's not pretty," he said, handing the bundle to Anne, "but it'll hold a leg together," and smiled faintly. "I'll take function over beauty any day." The Japanese assault began with an unrelenting air raid. From the trenches, Joe Adams watched in stunned silence as enemy bombers dropped their payloads with terrifying precision. The beach erupted in fire and sand as explosions lit up the early morning darkness. Joe's squad leader, Sergeant Mike Harris, barked orders to spread out and hold their ground. "They want this rock. Let's make and bleed for it," Harris yelled, his voice cutting through the cacophony. And, meanwhile, faced a different battle. The infirmary shook with every distant explosion, and the smell of antiseptic mixed with the acrid stench of burning oil. A young corpsman, no older than 18, stumbled into the room, his face pale. "They're everywhere," he whispered, clutching at the doorframe for support, and placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Look at me," she said firmly. "We have work to do." Her voice snapped him back to the present, and he nodded, following her to a stretcher where a Marine lay moaning with a chest wound. What stood out that day wasn't just the chaos, but the absurdity of war's small, surreal moments. One of the wounded men brought and carried an unscathed metal lunchbox in his hand. Inside was an untouched sandwich, which he handed to a bewildered corpsman before passing out. Another Marine arrived with a makeshift bandage wrapped around his arm, made from what appeared to be part of a parachute canopy. "Lost my uniform shirt," he mumbled as and began cleaning the wound. Figured silk was next best. As the bombardment subsided, the Japanese launched their amphibious assault. From the hills above the beach, Joe Adams watched as the enemy landing craft drew closer. His squad opened fire, the sharp cracks of their rifles lost in the cacophony of return fire from the Japanese. Joe took aim and fired, his hand steady despite the cold knot of fear in his stomach. Beside him, Sergeant Harris shouted encouragement. "Keep it up, Joe. They can't take us all." Then a shell exploded nearby, throwing Joe to the ground. His ears rang as he pushed himself up, blinking through the haze of dust. Harris lay a few feet away, motionless. Joe crawled to him, his hands shaking as he checked for a pulse. "Come on, Sarge," he muttered, his voice breaking. Harris's eyes fluttered open, and he grinned weakly. "That all you got, Adams?" he rasped. Joe laughed despite himself, his relief palpable. He quickly tied one of Tom Hensley's improvised tourniquets around Harris's bleeding leg and waved for help. Back at the infirmary, and was faced with a grim challenge. A Marine had been brought in with a mangled arm that needed to be amputated. With no proper surgical equipment, she improvised with a bone saw salvaged from the construction crew. The young man, conscious but pale, stared at her with wide eyes. "Will I make it?" he asked, and knelt beside him, meeting his gaze. "You've made it this far," she said, her voice firm. "I won't let you stop now." As the fighting intensified, Tom Hensley's resourcefulness proved invaluable. He arrived at the infirmary with an assortment of tools, offering to help however he could. At one point, he used a wrench to tighten a splint on a Marine's shattered leg. "Didn't think I'd be using this for battlefield surgery," he joked, his humor a brief reprieve from the grim reality around him, and glanced at him, exhaustion evident in her eyes. "You're saving lives," she said simply. "Don't sell yourself short." By late afternoon, the defenders managed to repel the assault, sinking 2 Japanese destroyers and forcing the remaining troops to retreat. The victory was hard-won, and the toll was evident in the haunted expressions of the survivors. Joe Adams sat on a crate near the beach, staring at the lucky coin in his hand. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to cry, not out of grief, but out of sheer relief that he and Harris were still alive. The infirmary was quieter that evening, though the air was thick with exhaustion and grief, and cleaned her instruments in a makeshift basin, her hands trembling slightly. Tom Hensley sat across from her, wrapping a fresh bandage around his own arm. "You ever think about how crazy this all is?" he asked, and looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Every day," she replied. After a pause, she added, "But we keep going, because we have to." Wake Island's defenders had once again defied the odds, but everyone knew the battle was far from over. For Joe Adams, the fight was no longer just about survival. It was about honoring the promise he'd made to Eddie Morales. For Tom Hensley, it was about proving that courage came in many forms. And for Anne Gilbert, it was about saving every life she could, one desperate moment at a time. The days following the second assault on Wake Island blurred into an unrelenting grind. Bombing raids became a daily ritual, each more destructive than the last. Sandbags and rubble became the island's only defenses, and the air was thick with the acrid stench of burning oil and the metallic tang of blood. The constant shelling fractured not only the ground beneath the defenders' feet, but also their spirits. Anne Gilbert's infirmary, once a functional but modest facility, now operated in the shadow of devastation. A corner of the building had collapsed after a near-direct hit, forcing her team to move their makeshift triage station into a partially buried bunker. Inside, the air was stifling and smelled of sweat and iodine. Supplies were dangerously low, and Anne's ability to adapt had never been more critical. One of the corpsmen, James Jimmy Reynolds, barely older than 19, approached and with a grim expression. "We're out of morphine, ma'am," he said, holding up the last empty vial. Don't know what we're going to do when the next ones come in. Anne's face tightened, but her voice remained steady. We'll manage, she replied, even as her mind raced for solutions. She sent Jimmy to scavenge whatever supplies he could from the ruins of nearby buildings, knowing full well it was a gamble. The Japanese bombers rarely left enough intact to salvage. One of the men who had been quietly helping behind the scenes was Walter Wally Grayson, a civilian radio operator. Wally had been stationed on Wake Island to maintain communication equipment, but had become a jack-of-all-trades since the siege began. When he wasn't relaying critical messages to Pearl Harbor, he was hauling wounded Marines to the infirmary or ferrying sandbags to reinforce the trenches. That day, he approached them with a bundle of wires and what looked like a makeshift hand crank. "If you can keep that generator running, I can rig this to sterilize the tools," he said, and raised an eyebrow, impressed despite herself. "You're an engineer now?" she asked. More like a desperate guy with a lot of time to think, Wally replied, a crooked grin on his face, and nodded, already planning how to implement his idea. "Desperation can be useful," she said. "Let's see what you've got." Meanwhile, the Japanese artillery fire had grown more precise. Marines huddled in their foxholes as shells burst around them, sending plumes of sand and smoke into the air. In one trench, Private Henry Carson struggled to keep his fear in check. Every explosion felt like it was meant for him. Beside him, Sergeant Mike Harris, still limping from his shrapnel wound, gritted his teeth and barked orders. "Don't think about it, Carson. Focus on the next shot." Carson nodded, his hands trembling as he loaded his rifle. The relentless shelling was taking a toll on everyone, but Harris's presence was an anchor. Even injured, he refused to let his men falter. "We're still here," Harris said, his voice carrying over the chaos. "And as long as we're here, they don't win." As the bombardment eased, Anne and her team braced for the inevitable wave of wounded. Among them was Corporal Frank Red Peterson, whose arm hung limply at his side, blood seeping through his uniform. He was a quiet man, known for his dry humor, but now his face was pale, and his breathing was labored, and moved quickly, examining the wound. "It's broken, maybe worse," she said, motioning for Jimmy to bring splints. "We'll get you fixed up, but you need to stay still." Red gritted his teeth. "I didn't think I'd end up here," he muttered. "Thought I was too lucky for that," and looked him in the eye, her hand steady as she applied a tourniquet. "Luck is what brought you here alive," she said firmly. "Let's keep it that way." Outside the infirmary, Wally worked tirelessly to maintain the radio equipment. Every few hours, he sent updates to Pearl Harbor, detailing the increasingly dire situation. The Japanese blockades were cutting off resupply efforts, and morale was beginning to fray. "They have to know we're not giving up," Wally muttered to himself, twisting a dial as he tried to boost the signal. One evening, as the defenders huddled in their makeshift shelters, a rare lull in the shelling allowed for a fleeting moment of reflection. Joe Adams sat beside Harris, his lucky coin in his hand. "You think we'll make it out of this?" he asked, his voice low. Harris took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "Doesn't matter," he said. "We've got today. We hold today." For Anne, these moments of quiet were almost harder than the chaos. Every silence felt like the calm before another storm. She sat against the wall of the infirmary, her hands wrapped around a cup of lukewarm water. Across from her, Jimmy Reynolds leaned against a crate, his exhaustion evident. "You ever wonder why we're still standing?" Jimmy asked, his voice barely above a whisper, and didn't answer immediately. She thought of the men she couldn't save, of the faces that haunted her dreams. But then she thought of Wally's makeshift sterilizer, of Harris holding his men together, of Joe and his lucky coin. "Because we have to be," she said finally, "because they need us to be." By the end of the week, the defenders had adapted to the unrelenting assaults. Marines rotated shifts, the civilians worked tirelessly to shore up defenses, and Anne's bunker-turned infirmary continued to function against all odds. But supplies were critically low, and everyone knew the Japanese wouldn't relent. The men of Wake Island had become a thorn in the side of a vast war machine, and the enemy was determined to crush them. For now, though, they held, and as and prepared for another long night, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in days. Hope. It was fragile, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And as long as it existed, so would she. The final assault on Wake Island began in the dead of night. The darkness split by flashes of artillery fire and the drone of low-flying bombers. The air was dense with smoke and salt, a suffocating reminder that the island's defenders were cornered. Anne Gilbert was crouched in the infirmary, her hands gripping a pair of forceps as she tried to stem the bleeding from a young Marine's abdomen. She barely registered the explosions outside, but each tremor shook loose another piece of plaster from the ceiling. In the trenches, Corporal Joe Adams clutched his rifle, his breath shallow and rapid. His thoughts wandered to his father's farm back in Louisiana. How he used to rise with the sun to mend fences or feed the cattle. The serenity of those memories was a sharp contrast to the chaos around him. "They'll be on us by dawn," muttered Sergeant Mike Harris beside him, his voice a low growl. "Keep your head, Adams. You've got one job. Don't miss." As the Japanese forces advanced, one of their soldiers, Private Kenji Tanaka, felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He wasn't a hardened warrior. Barely 20 years old, Kenji had been a farmhand in a quiet village before being drafted into the Imperial Army. Now he was here, wading through surf toward a beach littered with wreckage and bodies. His commanding officer had told him this would be an easy victory, that the Americans were on their last legs. But Kenji could see the determination in their defense, the grim defiance in the faces of the Marines who fought on despite overwhelming odds. Kenji's hand trembled as he gripped his rifle, wincing as another burst of gunfire erupted from the American lines. For the Emperor, he muttered under his breath, as much a prayer as a mantra to keep himself moving. Inside the infirmary, and was battling her own doubts. She moved from one patient to the next, her mind racing with calculations. How much blood had been lost? Could this man survive another hour? She tried to push the doubts away, but they lingered like shadows. As she cleaned a wound on a Marine's arm, he looked up at her, his face pale but calm. "Will it hurt?" he asked, and hesitated, then gave him a faint smile. "Probably," she admitted. "But you've handled worse, haven't you?" The Marine chuckled weakly. "Guess so." He squeezed his eyes shut as she began stitching. Outside, the Japanese pushed forward, their numbers overwhelming. Joe Adams fired round after round, his hands steady but his heart pounding. Each shot seemed to blur into the next, a rhythm of desperation. He glanced at Harris, who was yelling orders despite the blood seeping through the bandage on his leg. "Where's the air cover?" Harris shouted to no one in particular. "They're not coming." Another Marine yelled back. A shell exploded nearby, and Joe felt the ground shift beneath him. When he looked up, Harris was gone. He scrambled toward the spot where the sergeant had been, only to find him pinned beneath a collapsed sandbag wall. Harris's eyes fluttered open as Joe tried to lift the debris. "Get back to your post, Adams," Harris rasped, his voice barely audible. "That's an order." "No," Joe said firmly, his voice breaking. "Not leaving you." Harris managed a faint smile. "You're a stubborn bastard. Now, go." Reluctantly, Joe obeyed, crawling back to his position with Harris's voice echoing in his ears. The Japanese broke through the beach defenses as the sun began to rise. Kenji Tanaka found himself face to face with an American Marine, their rifles raised in unison. For a brief moment, neither man fired. Kenji saw the exhaustion in the Marine's eyes, the same weariness he felt in his own bones. But then instinct took over, and Kenji pulled the trigger. The Marine fell, clutching his chest, and Kenji staggered backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Forgive me," he whispered, though he knew no one could hear. In the infirmary, Anne and her team worked feverishly to move the wounded to a safer location. The building had become a death trap, with shells landing closer by the minute. Tom Hensley, the civilian mechanic, was hauling a stretcher when he paused to look at Anne. "This is it, isn't it?" he asked quietly, and met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Not while we're still standing," she replied, as they moved the last of the patients to a nearby cave, and noticed a small object lying in the dirt, a tattered photograph of a woman and a child. She picked it up, brushing off the grime. It belonged to one of the Marines, she realized, though she couldn't remember who. The image stuck with her, a haunting reminder of what these men had left behind. The cave became their final refuge. The air inside was damp and heavy, filled with the muffled sounds of the battle outside, and did her best to keep the wounded calm, but the tension was palpable. Wally Grayson, the radio operator, sat near the entrance, his hands wrapped around a broken piece of equipment. "They've got us," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Not yet," and said firmly, "As long as we're breathing, we fight." The end came with little fanfare. The Japanese forces overwhelmed the remaining defenders, and the sounds of gunfire gave way to an eerie silence. Anne and the others were discovered in the cave, their hands raised in surrender, as the Japanese soldiers marched them out, and caught a glimpse of Private Kenji Tanaka. Their eyes met briefly, and Anne was struck by the haunted look in the young soldier's face. She wondered if he saw her the same way, a human being, caught in a nightmare they hadn't chosen. As the sun set over Wake Island, the fires from the battle still smoldered, sending columns of smoke into the sky, and clutched the tattered photograph she had found, her resolve unbroken despite the weight of defeat. Wake Island had fallen, but the spirit of its defenders and of those like Anne Gilbert would endure. The days after Wake Island's surrender were a grim blur for the prisoners. Herded into a tightly confined area surrounded by barbed wire, the survivors faced the raw reality of captivity under an enemy who saw them as less than human. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, the tropic sun blistered their skin, and the air was thick with despair. For Anne Gilbert, the battle had shifted from saving lives amid gunfire to preserving dignity and hope in a place designed to strip both away. Anne's first confrontation with the brutality of her captors came during a distribution of water rations. A Marine, barely able to stand, reached out for his portion too soon, and a Japanese guard struck him across the face with the butt of his rifle. Anne, standing nearby, instinctively stepped forward, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Stop! He's injured. He needs water." The guard turned to her, his face dark with anger. For a tense moment, it seemed he might strike her too. But then, another voice interrupted. Let her speak. Sergeant Hiroshi Takada stepped forward, his tone calm but authoritative. He stared at Anne, his gaze piercing yet curious. "Why do you care so much for them?" "They are beaten." Anne's reply was steady, her words carrying the weight of conviction. "Because they're human, and so are you." Hiroshi said nothing, but he gestured for the Marine to receive his water. Anne didn't thank him. Gratitude felt misplaced in this moment, but her defiance was a small victory. Hiroshi turned and walked away, leaving the other guards to enforce the line with rough shouts and shoves. Inside the barbed wire, and worked tirelessly, the infirmary was little more than a shaded corner of the compound, with scraps of cloth for bandages and rainwater collected in makeshift containers. One of the wounded, Private Jack Henderson, was succumbing to a severe infection. His leg, injured in the final battle, was swollen and foul-smelling, and knew that without proper care, he wouldn't survive the week. And Jack rasped one evening, his voice weak but insistent. "Don't waste your energy on me. There are others, stronger ones, who have a chance." "Stop talking nonsense," Anne replied, her tone firm as she cleaned his wound. "You're not done fighting yet." Another prisoner, a civilian engineer named Carl Larkin, observed the exchange from nearby. Unlike Jack, Carl had thrown himself into captivity with grim determination. A skilled mechanic, He had begun using his knowledge to repair tools for the Japanese in exchange for extra scraps of food, which he quietly distributed to the weakest among them. Carl's resourcefulness earned him respect among the prisoners, though it also drew suspicion from the guards. One night, Carl approached and with an idea. If we could rig up a filtration system, we might be able to make the rainwater safer to drink, he said, sketching a rough design in the dirt, and studied his plans, impressed by their ingenuity. Together, they scavenged materials, broken barrels, scraps of cloth, even charcoal from the cooking fires. Within days, the makeshift filter was operational, and it marveled at how a simple invention could provide a glimmer of hope. But hope was fragile in this place. The prisoners lived under constant psychological pressure. The guards conducted random inspections, shouting commands in a language most of the Americans didn't understand, and often found herself translating gestures and tones, relying on intuition to avoid escalation. Despite the cultural chasm between captors and captives, there were moments of unexpected humanity. One evening, as intended to a small group of feverish men, a young Japanese soldier approached her with a small parcel. It was a bundle of rice, wrapped in a cloth. He placed it on the ground without meeting her eyes and whispered, "For them?" and hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. But the soldier's hands were trembling, and his expression was a mix of guilt and determination. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. The soldier didn't answer. He simply bowed his head and walked away, leaving him with more questions than answers. Later, she learned his name was Kenji Tanaka, a conscript who had joined the army to support his family back home. His quiet act of kindness was a stark contrast to the cruelty she had witnessed from others, and it reminded her that war did not erase humanity. It merely buried it beneath layers of fear and duty. The harsh conditions took their toll on everyone. Dysentery spread quickly, and Anne fought to control the outbreak with limited resources. She boiled water over small fires, improvised latrines, and insisted on basic hygiene despite the guards' impatience. Her efforts were not always successful, and each loss weighed heavily on her. One morning, she found herself holding the hand of a Marine as he took his final breath. His last words were barely audible. "Tell my mom, I tried," and sat beside his body for a long time, her hands trembling with exhaustion and grief. She wondered how much longer she could endure this, how much more she could give before breaking. But then she remembered the photograph in her pocket, the woman and child who had become her talisman. She couldn't fail them, just as she couldn't fail the men who still clung to her for strength. In the midst of despair, there were moments of resilience. Carl's filtration system was a success, and the prisoners began to rally around small acts of defiance, sharing a joke, carving a crude chessboard into the dirt, or simply refusing to let the guards see them break, and became a symbol of their determination, her quiet courage inspiring others to find their own. As the sun set over the compound one evening, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, and sat beside Carl and Jack, the three of them shared a rare moment of silence, their eyes fixed on the horizon. "Do you think they'll come for us?" Jack asked, his voice tinged with both hope and doubt. "They will," Anne said, her tone unwavering. "And when they do, we'll still be standing." The others nodded, drawing strength from her certainty. Wake Island had fallen, but the spirit of its defenders and of Anne Gilbert remained unbroken. The battle for survival would continue, but in their unity, they found the seeds of victory. Life in the camp had settled into a grim routine, marked by hunger, sickness, and the ever-present threat of punishment. Anne Gilbert, though worn down by weeks of physical and emotional strain, remained a quiet leader among the prisoners. She had built trust not only among the Americans, but also in the unlikeliest places, the Japanese guards, who both admired and distrusted her determination. One morning, and noticed Private Carl Larkin hunched over in the corner of the compound, his usually sturdy demeanor replaced by a haunted, hollow look. Carl had been the anchor for many prisoners, his ingenuity and resourcefulness a source of hope. But now, the weight of captivity seemed to have crushed him. Anne approached, kneeling beside him in the dirt. "Carl," she said softly, "what's going on?" He didn't answer at first, staring at the ground as if searching for words. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep seeing them, the ones we left behind, the ones we couldn't save," and placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip firm but gentle. "We did everything we could, and now we do what we can here. That's how we honor them." Carl looked up at her, his eyes red-rimmed. "How do you keep going?" And hesitated, considering her answer. "Because they need me to, and because someday we'll get out of here. When that day comes, I want to look back and know I didn't give up." Carl nodded slowly, the faintest flicker of resolve returning to his expression. It was a small victory, but in a place like this, every victory mattered. Later that day, and made her way to the infirmary, a makeshift area with little more than tattered blankets for bedding and a handful of supplies she had managed to scavenge. She had recently taken on a new assistant, a young Marine named Danny O'Connell. Barely out of his teens, Danny had no medical training, but his energy and optimism were a balm to both Anne and the patients. "Miss Gilbert," Danny said as she entered, "I think we might have a problem with Private Jennings. His fever's spiking again," and knelt beside the cot where Jennings lay, his face pale and drenched with sweat. She felt his forehead and checked the wound on his leg, a deep gash that had become infected despite her best efforts. Supplies were critically low, and the risk of sepsis loomed over every injury. "We're out of antibiotics," and murmured, more to herself than to Danny. "Boil some water. We'll clean the wound again and hope for the best." As Danny hurried to obey, Anne's mind raced. She knew the Japanese kept medical supplies in their camp, but accessing them was a near impossible gamble. The guards had made it clear that theft would be met with execution, and the risk of being caught was enormous. Yet the alternative, letting Jennings die, was unthinkable. That night, Anne made her decision. She approached Carl, who had spent the evening repairing a broken water barrel. "Carl, I need your help," she said in a low voice. "There's something I have to do, but I can't do it alone." He listened as she outlined her plan, his expression shifting from skepticism to reluctant agreement. "You're insane," he said when she finished. "But I'll do it. Just tell me what you need." Under cover of darkness, the two of them crept toward the Japanese side of the camp, and had memorized the guards' patrol patterns over weeks of observation, and she guided Carl with whispered instructions. They reached the supply tent without incident, but the hardest part was yet to come. Inside, shelves lined with precious supplies loomed in the dim light, and moved quickly, selecting a small vial of antibiotics and a roll of bandages. As they turned to leave, a sudden noise froze them in place, the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps just outside. Carl's hand tightened on her arm, his breath shallow. They had seconds to act. Thinking quickly, and knocked over a stack of crates on the opposite side of the tent, creating a distraction. The guard, startled by the noise, moved away to investigate, and then Carl slipped out, their hearts pounding, and made it back to the prisoner's side just as dawn began to break. The stolen supplies were a lifeline, and used the antibiotics to treat Jennings, and within days, his fever began to subside. Word of the daring theft spread quickly among the prisoners, and though Anne swore Carl to secrecy, the others began to look at her with a mix of awe and gratitude. Not all the Japanese guards were blind to what had happened. Hiroshi Takata approached, and the following week, his expression unreadable. "You're bold," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "But boldness can get you killed," and met his gaze without flinching. "Boldness is the only thing keeping us alive." For a moment, Takata said nothing, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. Then he turned and walked away, leaving Anne to wonder whether his words were a warning or a threat. Life in the camp continued, a relentless cycle of survival and resilience. One day, Danny approached, and with a crude map he had drawn, marking potential escape routes he had overheard the guards discussing, and studied it. her mind racing with possibilities, but she knew the time wasn't right. For now, their focus had to remain on survival. As the weeks turned into months, Anne found herself reflecting on the choices she had made. The theft, the risks, the quiet defiance. Each act felt like a small rebellion against the crushing weight of captivity. But she also knew that her actions came at a cost. The guards were watching her more closely now, and any misstep could bring severe consequences. Despite the constant danger, Anne refused to give in to despair. Each life she saved, each small act of defiance, was a reminder that even in the darkest of circumstances, hope could survive. The war wasn't over, and neither was her fight. The camp was a crucible, forging unbreakable bonds among the prisoners. Anne's determination inspired others to find strength they didn't know they had. And though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear. They would not face it alone. Together, they would endure, and when the time came, they would be ready to reclaim their freedom. The faint sound of engines approaching over the horizon stirred a ripple of anticipation among the prisoners. It was early morning, and the sky over Wake Island was a pale wash of orange and blue. Anne Gilbert stood near the edge of the camp, shading her eyes as she tried to make sense of the commotion. From the faint murmur of Japanese guards to the whispers spreading through the prisoners, one word was clear: liberation. For 3 long years, Anne and the other prisoners had endured the unthinkable. Their lives had become a relentless fight for survival against hunger, sickness, and the crushing weight of captivity. But today, there was hope. As the sound of American bombers grew louder, Anne's heart raced. She had heard rumors of the Allies closing in on Japanese-held territories, but they had seemed distant, almost impossible to believe. Now, as the guards scrambled to prepare for an imminent attack, the promise of freedom felt real. Danny O'Connell, now a gaunt shadow of the lively boy she had first met in the infirmary, sidled up beside her. "Do you think it's really happening?" he asked, his voice low but tinged with excitement, and glanced at him, her lips forming a faint, hopeful smile. "I think it is, and I think we need to be ready." The prisoners had long been preparing for this moment, quietly and secretly. Over the years, they had formed a network of communication, passing information and supplies under the noses of their captors, and had played a crucial role in maintaining morale, reminding the others that they had to hold on just a little longer. But now, with liberation at hand, she felt the weight of responsibility more acutely than ever. When the first wave of American planes appeared in the sky, the island erupted into chaos. Japanese soldiers scrambled to man anti-aircraft guns, their shouts cutting through the roar of engines and the distant thud of explosions. The prisoners, confined to their quarters, could do little but wait, and gathered a small group of the weakest among them, checking wounds and offering quiet reassurances. "We'll be out of here soon," she told Carl Larkin, who lay on a cot with a bandaged leg. His injury, sustained during a failed escape attempt months earlier, had left him weak but defiant. "Just hang on a little longer." Carl gritted his teeth and nodded. "I'm not giving up now." The airstrikes intensified and the ground trembled beneath them. From the small window of their barracks, Anne caught glimpses of American troops landing on the beaches. The sight filled her with a mixture of relief and dread. The liberation of Wake Island would not come easily. The Japanese were prepared to fight to the last man. Hours later, as the sound of gunfire grew closer, the prisoners realized that the tide of the battle had shifted. Japanese guards began retreating, some fleeing into the jungle, while others made desperate last stands. And watched as one of the guards, Takata, who had occasionally shown her moments of reluctant kindness, hesitated near the edge of the compound. Their eyes met briefly before he turned and disappeared into the chaos. The moment the gates were forced open by American Marines, the prisoners erupted into cheers. Soldiers poured into the compound, their faces a mix of relief and determination, and stepped forward, her heart pounding, as one of the Marines approached. "Are you and Gilbert?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion welling up inside her. "We've heard about you," the Marine said. "You've done more for these people than anyone could have imagined," and shook her head. "It wasn't just me. We all survived together." The days following their liberation were a blur of medical evaluations, debriefings, and reunions. Many of the prisoners, including Anne, were in critical condition from years of malnutrition and illness. But the overwhelming sense of freedom outweighed any physical pain. One night, as they were being transported to a nearby base, Anne found herself sitting beside Danny. He was staring out the window, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the moon. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Home," he said after a long pause. "But also everything we went through. I don't think I'll ever forget it," and nodded, her own thoughts drifting to the countless lives they had lost along the way. "We shouldn't forget," she said, "but we also have to live for them. That's the best way to honor their memory." The return to the United States was both joyous and overwhelming, and was hailed as a hero, though she resisted the label. She accepted the accolades with quiet humility, always emphasizing the collective strength of those who had endured alongside her. In Washington, D.C., Anne was awarded the Medal of Freedom in a solemn ceremony. As she stood before the gathered crowd, the weight of the moment pressed down on her. She thought of the faces of those she had lost and the strength of those who had survived. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and filled with conviction. "This medal isn't for me alone," she said. "It's for everyone who stood together, who refused to give up even when the odds were against us. It's for those who didn't make it home, and for those who carry their memory. We are here today because of them." The room erupted into applause, but Anne's thoughts were elsewhere. She had survived the unthinkable and had saved countless lives along the way. But her journey wasn't over. She had a story to tell, and a duty to ensure that the lessons of Wake Island were never forgotten. As the ceremony ended and Anne stepped into the sunlight, she felt a sense of closure. The war had taken so much from her, but it had also revealed the depths of human resilience and compassion. And in that, she found hope for the future, and Gilbert's legacy unfolded in ways that no one, including herself, could have anticipated. Though celebrated as a hero upon her return, the true breadth of her influence went far beyond medals and ceremonies. Her actions and choices, forged in the crucible of Wake Island, resonated across decades, touching lives in ways both profound and unexpected. One of the most surprising outcomes of Anne's wartime efforts was their direct influence on a major post-war reform in military health care. In 1948, during congressional hearings about the state of military medical services, one senator cited Anne's improvised techniques as evidence of the need for better supplies and training for combat medics and nurses. This testimony, combined with her own written accounts of resource shortages on Wake Island, helped spark the modernization of field medicine in the U.S. Armed Forces. Anne's creative use of materials, turning parachute silk into surgical bandages, for example, was later integrated into military training programs as a case study in ingenuity under pressure. Her story also influenced medical practices in unexpected arenas. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, an American doctor on a naval vessel used a method described in Anne's memoir to stabilize a sailor with a severe injury when conventional tools were unavailable. When asked about his resourcefulness, the doctor pointed to Anne's story as his inspiration. Despite the admiration she received, Anne's post-war life wasn't without its challenges. In the 1950s, a controversy arose surrounding her memoir, Silent Courage. Some critics accused her of romanticizing war, arguing that her depiction of resilience and sacrifice overshadowed the brutal realities of the battlefield. Others questioned the accuracy of certain anecdotes, implying that her accounts were dramatized to capture public attention. Anne, though pained by the criticism, addressed it head-on. "War is neither romantic nor glorified," she said during a rare television interview. "But in the darkest times, we find glimmers of humanity. That's what I wanted people to see. This period also brought deeper personal reflections for Anne. Though fiercely independent, her experiences had left scars that were difficult to share with others. Her relationships with family and friends often bore the weight of her wartime trauma. Anne's niece, Clara, would later recount how Anne avoided discussing the war in casual conversation, preferring to focus on her garden or the stories of others. She carried so much inside, Clara said, but she always made room for everyone else's pain. However, Anne's connection with others remained a cornerstone of her life. One particularly poignant relationship was with her former patient, Lieutenant Michael Hansen, whom she had saved during the final days on Wake Island. After the war, they corresponded for years, their letters a mix of shared memories and philosophical musings about survival and loss. When Michael passed away in 1968, his family reached out to Anne, thanking her for giving him those extra decades of life. Anne's influence extended beyond personal connections. In 1955, a young nurse named Eleanor Carlisle attended one of Anne's public lectures on wartime nursing. Eleanor would later become the head of a prominent nursing program in Chicago, citing Anne as her lifelong inspiration. "When I was at my lowest," Eleanor wrote in a letter to Anne, "I thought of you on that island, finding strength where there was none. You taught me that compassion is not just a feeling. It's an action." Anne's personal life, while quieter, was no less meaningful. She never married but maintained a close circle of friends and colleagues. Among them was Dr. Henry Webb, a fellow Wake Island survivor who had worked alongside her in the makeshift hospital during the siege. Their friendship deepened over the years, and though they never publicly spoke of it, many suspected their bond was rooted in an unspoken love that endured long after the war, and also remained deeply connected to Wake Island itself. Though she never returned to the site, she corresponded with veterans groups dedicated to preserving its history. In 1972, she spearheaded a campaign to have the island recognized as a national memorial. Her efforts paid off, and a plaque was installed, bearing the names of those who had fought and fallen there. Among the inscriptions was a simple line attributed to Anne: "In the face of despair, we chose to stand together." The twilight of Anne's life was marked by a quieter but no less impactful legacy. She spent much of her time mentoring young nurses, often inviting them to her home for informal discussions. One nurse, Jessica Nguyen, recalled how Anne had given her a hand-stitched journal as a gift, urging her to write down not only her clinical observations, but also the emotions and stories that shaped her journey. "You'll need this," Anne had said, "because in the end, it's the people who will teach you, not the textbooks." Anne's final years were spent in a small house surrounded by a flourishing garden, a place of peace and reflection. Despite her physical frailty, she continued to write letters, advocate for healthcare reform, and host gatherings of veterans and nurses. Her passing in 1987, though mourned, became a moment of collective gratitude. At her funeral, a former Wake Island prisoner of war delivered a moving eulogy. "She was our light," he said, "in a place where hope had no business existing. She gave us reason to believe." Today, Anne's name is synonymous with courage, compassion, and resilience, not as abstract ideals but as lived truths. Her story continues to inspire not only medical professionals, but also anyone who faces adversity. Her legacy is not just a testament to her time on Wake Island, but a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, humanity can prevail. The story of Wake Island is more than a narrative of war. It is a symbol of resilience, sacrifice, and the extraordinary capacity of individuals to stand against overwhelming odds. It stands as a testament to the courage of those who endured the unimaginable and reminds us of the price of freedom and the enduring spirit of humanity. At the center of this story is Anne Gilbert, whose unwavering dedication has become a touchstone for generations. Wake Island has come to represent a microcosm of human endurance, and Anne's name is inseparably linked with its legacy. For veterans, the island is a place of both heartbreak and pride. Its history has been preserved through commemorations, documentaries, and the testimonies of those who survived. For Americans, Wake Island is more than just a dot on the map. It is a living reminder of the valor and sacrifices of the past. In the years after the war, historians and journalists grappled with how to encapsulate the events on Wake Island and Anne's role within them. Was she merely a product of her circumstances, or did she embody something universal? Anne herself shied away from such lofty interpretations, once telling a reporter, "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just refused to stop trying." Yet her impact reverberated in ways she could never have anticipated. Her story became required reading in nursing schools across the country, not just as an example of battlefield medicine, but as an enduring lesson in empathy and creativity under pressure. Students were asked to consider not only her medical techniques, but also her ability to inspire hope in those around her. Her legacy also shaped military policy. Following extensive campaigns by Wake Island survivors and Anne supporters, Congress passed legislation recognizing the contributions of women in wartime, leading to expanded roles for military nurses and female personnel. This recognition was more than symbolic. It paved the way for future generations of women in the armed forces. The importance of remembering Anne's contributions extends beyond the battlefield. In 1985, the Anne Gilbert Memorial Scholarship was established to support young women pursuing careers in medicine or humanitarian fields. Over the years, recipients of the scholarship have gone on to become doctors, nurses, and advocates for global health initiatives. Many credit Anne's story as their inspiration, citing her as a beacon of what it means to serve others selflessly. Wake Island itself has been transformed into a solemn tribute. Every December, a small group of veterans, family members, and historians gather at the memorial plaque to honor the defenders of the island. Among the speakers, there is often someone who reads Anne's words. "In the face of despair, we chose to stand together." These ceremonies are marked not by fanfare, but by quiet reverence, reflecting the spirit of those who fought and lived through the ordeal. But Anne's influence is not confined to the United States. In Japan, her actions have also sparked reflection. In 1995, during a reconciliation ceremony between American and Japanese veterans, a former Japanese soldier who had been stationed on Wake Island spoke about witnessing Anne's bravery. He recounted how he had seen her tending to wounded prisoners, her face calm but resolute. "She showed us the best of humanity," he said. "Even in a time of great cruelty, she reminded us of compassion." The enduring lessons of Anne's life are not limited to the realms of war or medicine. They speak to something profoundly human, the importance of acting with integrity, even in the bleakest of circumstances. Her story has inspired not only medical professionals, but also educators, artists, and community leaders who find in her an example of steadfastness and humility. In her later years, Anne expressed a wish that her story not be framed solely as one of heroism, but as a reminder of the strength found in community. "It wasn't just me," she wrote in one of her final letters. "We survived because we leaned on one another." Wake Island wasn't about individuals. It was about what we achieved together. Anne's passing marked the end of an era, but her memory continues to be a guiding light. In the decades since her death, her influence has only grown, her story finding new audiences through books, films, and oral histories. Yet, perhaps her greatest legacy is the quiet impact she has had on countless lives. People who, like Anne, have found themselves in moments of crisis and chosen to stand firm. The story of Wake Island, and of Anne Gilbert in particular, reminds us of the profound cost of war and the enduring power of the human spirit. It is a history that demands not only to be remembered, but to be learned from, a lesson in both the fragility and the resilience of humanity. As one of her fellow survivors once said, "And didn't just save lives, she saved our belief in what it means to be human." Thank you for listening. Don't forget to leave a comment, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps this community growing and motivates me to bring you more incredible stories.